nourished as human beings. And as Aya has already brought up, that we can help other people learn how to practice it as well. And I can go further. Should I just launch in right now, or are there any other announcements or anything you need?
No, I think we are ready to start. Thank you everyone again for joining us. And one more note, I did want to note that we are being funded for this experience by the U.S. Department of State Citizen Diplomacy Action Fund. So that's the reason that we're all able to be here together. And yeah, we are really excited to be hosting this workshop, and we're very grateful for Gracie for coming in and doing this workshop with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, let's talk about self-care. We were talking a little bit before we got started here, just if there's anything you want to share about self-care or anything that you have questions that you would like to ask, feel free to put them in the chat box. Also, I know I can speak really quickly sometimes. People tell me that all the time. So if I'm speaking too quickly and you want me to slow down, just send me a message or just put it in the chat box. And it's when I get excited, I speak quickly, and I get excited when I speak about self-care. I want to talk to you first around my own story and journey with self-care. And I do that because I had to learn a lot about self-care in order to practice it and help other people with it. And I think I can give you a bunch of tips, and there will be tips and things that you can do and practice that you'll get out of the workshop. But I think I hope that you can understand that self-care is a journey. It's not something that you're going to be good or bad at. So I'm going to share a little bit of my journey with you, and also tell you how I could be qualified to talk to anyone about self-care. So I always say that I learned the most about self-care by growing up in a family where people did not practice a lot of self-care. In my family growing up, there were issues with alcoholism and addiction, and there were issues with depression, and there was something I call it codependency, which is the idea that if you just kind of try to control and take care of everybody else, then you don't really have to deal with yourself as a person. And so growing up, I didn't have anyone to model self-care for me. I didn't have anyone to teach me how to slow down, how to listen to myself, how to set boundaries. And as I got older, I really struggled in a lot of my relationships in particular, of feeling like how to be myself, how to really tell people when I wanted something or tell people when I didn't want something. And I really struggled just to have good self-esteem and feel good about myself. I learned how to make good grades in school, and I worked really hard because I felt like if I could just make really good grades and be the best in that somehow I could get to this point where I felt good about myself. And so a lot of my journey has been having to understand that you can achieve everything you want in life. You can get the awesome job, you can get the awesome house, the awesome car, the awesome boyfriend or girlfriend. And if you don't feel good about who you are as a person, your own self, it's not going to feel good to have those things. And so a lot of what I've had to do in my life is to get the things that I wanted and then recognize that they weren't making me as happy as I wanted them to, and dig in further and further to say, like, why is that? And who am I? And what do I really need? And how do I take care of myself? And for me, the first time that I really understood what self-care could be is when I went into a yoga studio when I was in college. So it's probably a little older, I was like 21 years old. And I went into this yoga class, and I remember just looking around and being on my yoga mat and being like, this feels different. This feels like a place I can take care of myself. And it really started a big journey for me because I started to do yoga more and more. I became a yoga teacher. I became a full-time yoga teacher in Washington, D.C. I started leading yoga retreats around the world. I got to know people through that way. And it gave me this place to really learn about healing from the science that's thousands of years old that comes from where India is now. And it taught me so much about who I am, how to have a body, how to have emotions, how to have, thoughts in my mind, and so many things that growing up in the United States, I had no idea. So I feel very grateful to have found this ancient knowledge and be able to study it so much. And it really gave me a very firm foundation of self-care. And so when I was in my early 30s, I got excited to practice something. I'm going to put it in the chat box what it is. It's called Ayurveda. And Ayurveda, it's the sister science to yoga. So people have probably heard of yoga, practiced some yoga, and in Ayurveda, it's just as old as yoga. The oldest written documents ever are Ayurvedic texts. And it's a science of how to take care of yourself. So it's like how to wake up in the morning, what kinds of foods to eat for different body types, how to handle stress, how to have a spiritual experience. And I started to study this, and it really, really spoke to me. It really changed how I saw the world and how I started to see myself. And at that time, I was in a relationship with somebody that I thought we were going to get married to each other. I was really had a vision for how my life was going to go. But as I started to practice Ayurveda and I started to take better care of myself, I quickly understood that this was not the relationship for me. And I think I'd been clinging to it, trying to make the relationship work because I was really afraid of breaking up and going through, if anyone's gone through a breakup before, it can be very painful. And there's a real feeling of like losing your sense of self. And I had a lot of my sense of self wrapped up in this person. But I also had to listen to myself, and we broke up. And instead of falling apart, I actually felt like by practicing self-care, I felt so much stronger than I'd ever felt before. And I decided I was going to start a business teaching people about self-care. And I was so inspired. And it was around this time that I got a phone call from my father and telling me that he had cancer. And I did not think it was going to be a serious thing. The doctors thought he would have to do chemotherapy, but it kept getting worse and it kept getting worse. And during this whole time, I had been practicing so much self-care for myself that I recognized that one, I wasn't burning out. I was like doing my work, and then I was driving to the hospital to be with him. I was doing so much, but because I was taking care of myself, I was actually had a lot of energy, not just for myself, but I actually had energy to give him. I had not had a very easy relationship with my father, but it was having the self-care and the sense of myself. I was able to really forgive him. And when he did pass away, I felt like we were in such a better place. And he told a friend of his before he died that he kind of worried about my brother, is what he told her. But he didn't worry about me because he looked at me and he could see that I was really taking care of myself. And so it was in that experience that I recognized that I think for so long in my life, I thought that self-care was selfish, that if I took care of myself, that somehow it was going to hurt somebody else, it was going to inconvenience somebody else, which is a lot of why I don't think I did it. And I understood that actually self-care, it's how we take care of other people around us. That if I'm taking care of myself, no one else has to worry about me. And I actually have energy to support others, but only if I'm learning how to give myself that energy. So a lot of the work that I've done, it's been 7 years since then, and I've worked with hundreds, maybe thousands of people to help them with their self-care, to understand what self-care really is, to make self-care really work. And I've realized that it's, I don't know all the answers. I learn by teaching. And I recognize how much that when we start to take care of ourselves as people, that we start to spread that energy and we become the role models to teach other people about self-care. And we give other people that empowerment that I have found in it. So I feel very invested in teaching people that are leaders, because I found that the more that we can lead with self-care, the more we help anyone that we're leading, and the more we inspire other people. So I'm very happy to work with you all because, one, you're a very young group, young meaning you're just a lot younger than I am. I'm almost 40. And I wish I had really found this a lot earlier. I think my 20s would have been a lot easier if I had some idea around self-care that I was using. And also that I see you all as being the leaders that are coming up next in this world. And I hope that the self-care will help to further whatever it is that you're doing. So one, you don't burn out, and two, that you can just keep spreading the good energy, because I think everyone recognizes that we're in some pretty precarious, dangerous situations right now. And I really do think self-care is a big piece of starting to get ourselves to a place where things don't feel so threatening. So that's the introduction. And before I launch in, I just want to pause. And if you want to ask a question or put anything in the chat box, you can go ahead and do that. I like it to be very interactive, that you guys can share. Okay, from Qatar. Hi, thank you for sharing your journey and personal experience. It's pretty insightful. Thank you. I'm interested in knowing how to break the stigma about self-care and learning how to set a support system for oneself. Okay, well, we'll definitely talk about support systems. And there, I think that there's, hold on, take a sip of water. There's something, what I've realized about self-care is there's only so much we can do as people because we have to deal with culture. And I'll talk a lot about what that means. And so I think we have to recognize our power and our limitations. And so we will learn how to do some things for ourselves that could inspire other people around us. They will. And yet it's going to take a while to change culture. Here in the United States, we still have a lot of culture around this. And but I think the more of us that are doing it for ourselves, the more we can change culture. And then Aya is saying, what is something we can do every day to help with preventing burnout of students, especially those who struggle with perfectionism? Okay, we're going to talk about perfectionism next, so this is perfect. Thank you for that. And then Afaf is saying, I like the quote that says, the way we take care of ourselves is the way we teach other people to love us and take care of us. Absolutely. And that's what I found. And I had such a journey with relationships of not understanding why I wasn't being valued in relationships. And it was because I was not valuing myself. And when I started to change those patterns, it was very difficult for me to break those patterns of how we see ourselves in relationship. It was just an incredible amount of work. And yet I would not be in the marriage that I'm in now and not be able to have kids. And if I hadn't made some of those changes. So thank you for sharing that. So before I go to the next part, I'm remembering now that Tova, who is another AMP scholar, she is going to be coming on at 4:15, and she's going to share a little of her self-care journey too. So we'll prepare for that as well. I didn't want that to come in and surprise anyone. Okay, so the next, I want to talk about what authentic self-care is, because that's how I always talk about this work, that you can kind of read a magazine article about self-care and maybe they will suggest some things that will be helpful, but to really feel like you are taking care of yourself, I think you have to change and unlearn as much as you're learning. And so I'm going to talk about what authentic self-care is. And the first thing is that it's not self-improvement. And for those of you who, have some experience with learning about self-care and self-improvement, you'll see that those terms are used kind of interchangeably. And I actually think they're quite different. And so self-improvement, it pertains to what Aya is saying, to perfectionism. It's the idea that there's something wrong with us as people. And that could be, I'm too emotional, I'm too sensitive, I care too much, I don't learn the right way, I don't look the right way. Whatever it is that we feel like is our biggest vulnerability. And with self-improvement, we are working to kind of change that thing about ourselves. And it's based on this flawed premise that there's something wrong with us. And self-care is actually the opposite of that. That self-care is saying that no matter who I am, no matter what problems I struggle with, no matter what ways I see myself, I'm still worthy of care in this moment. And I can do that for myself. The next thing about authentic self-care is that it's not a to-do list. When I talk to people who are very overwhelmed about self-care, and I live in Washington, D.C., where people are just, Amber, you know this, people are very overwhelmed all the time. It's kind of a power city and people take on too much. And when I talk to people who are this way, I see this look in their eye, like, don't tell me to do one more thing because I don't have time to take care of myself. And it shows that there's a flaw in the way that we are looking at self-care, because let's say we have this boat and you have so much stuff in your boat and your boat is like sinking below the surface. And then I'm like, okay, but you need to put self-care in your boat. And you're like, but it'll sink if I put it in there. And what I'm asking you to do is to not think of self-care as one more thing to put in your boat, but actually to think of it as the boat itself. And so if the boat is, if it needs something to stay more buoyant, if you need to take some things out of the boat, but self-care is not something else to do, but rather it's the way that we hold everything that we care about and hold everything that we're doing, and we learn to make decisions based on our values. And then finally, authentic self-care is the way that we navigate what I see as a very toxic system of a world where we are, a consumerist world, where we think that money is more important than people, where we think that we don't need other people to help us survive. I'm really aware of like what it is to grow up in the United States, where it's a very consumerist, very capitalist culture. And I'm not sure if that translates exactly to the cultures that you live in. So feel free to put it in the chat box if you have anything you want to share about that as well. But I know that especially here that we're really taught this, I think, a very false sense of what it means to be in who we are as human beings. And it leads to a very dysfunctional, racist, classist society. And so, and when we look around, like I teach workshops and I'll go around and I'll say, how are you doing? And everyone's like, I'm anxious and I'm depressed. Like every person, I'm anxious and I'm depressed. And I think everybody really thinks that it's a personal problem, that if they could get their depression or they could get their anxiety under control. And what I see from my view is that we're all anxious and depressed, that maybe it's not us that's the problem, but maybe it's that we're living in a culture that's not helpful to being a human being in a way that we feel like we really get to be our authentic selves. And so what authentic self-care is that we learn to have a critical eye towards culture and not towards ourselves. So again, I'll pause, and if anyone has anything you want to share about that, go ahead and you can put anything in the chat box or unmute yourself. I'm happy to hear your voice too. Okay, I'm gonna keep going, but feel free to put it in there and we'll catch up there. So there are 3 levels of self-care that I could talk about self-care in a lot of ways. I'll say that first. But to simplify it so we can talk about self-care in a meaningful way in 90 minutes, I'm going to break this down in that there's 3 parts of self-care that if you are tending to these, I think you will feel a lot less overwhelmed by your life and a lot more empowered to make decisions based on your values. And I'll go into they're kind of simple in one way, but there's a lot to them. So especially this first level. So the first level I like to say is the outer layer of self-care. So this is how we take care of our bodies, how we eat, how we sleep, how we cook our food, how we go to bed at night. Like all of our habits are there. And to understand how we organize our time and our energy around our outer self-care, we have to understand our nervous systems. So there's a part of all of us that really wants to change and grow. And it's the part I think that probably motivates you to be here on a call like this. Like, I want to change. I want to do something different. I want to know more about self-care. And that's part of who you are. But there's this other part of who you are, which is it's your central nervous system. Like the lizard brain is how we say it sometimes. It's this really ancient thing that has just been passed down through the history of humanity, which tells us that change is threatening. Change is scary. If and it's the reason that we often do the same habits over and over again, even if they're not habits that really serve us, it's because our nervous system has been habituated. It means that our nervous system is comfortable doing these things. And to start to change, it's going to bring up fear. And our nervous system, it's conditioned this way because any variable in human history or animal history, like you walk into a different cave and maybe there's a bear in there and that's scary and that could kill you. So it's real, the reasons for that. But this part of our nervous system, it really, really gets overwhelmed easily by change. And so it's going to keep us doing what we normally do. And so what happens when we kind of go into changing our habits is that we have like the part of ourselves that's like, yes, I'm going to make a change. And then the other part of ourselves that's like, no, I'm not going to make that change. And then we kind of get into a war between those 2 parts. Particularly in the United States, and I'm curious how this translates too, is the only way that we're really taught to change anything is a willpower-based model. So willpower means, like, here we have New Year's Eve. So you have the like winter holidays, like Christmas and Hanukkah and all of that. And we all have these like really wild Decembers and we spend a lot of money and we eat too much. We don't take care of ourselves. And then we have this idea that on January 1st, when our new year starts over, that all of a sudden we're going to wake up the next morning and we're going to go to the gym every single day. And we're going to like not eat sugar anymore. We're going to stop drinking and we're going to make these radical changes in our lives. But we also have this really change averse nervous system that tells us that we can't do that. So what happens is the part of us that's motivated to change pushes ourselves really hard. And then we get exhausted by that. We can't sustain it. And we ultimately like stop doing the habits that we're trying to do. And I'm putting this in quote marks here, but we fail. We think that we're not good at doing self-care. And when I talk to people about self-care, I hear this so often, like, I'm not good at it. And what I hear in that is people saying, I tried to change and I couldn't change. I'm lazy. I'm not motivated enough. And what I think we really need to do in order to start to change is we have to learn what works and what doesn't work around change. So before I get into what does work around change and how to get past our nervous system, which is trying to get us not to change all the time, we have to talk about perfectionism, which is something I brought up. So what perfectionism is it's actually a response to trauma. And it can be personal trauma in your life. Like in my family growing up, like I grew up in an alcoholic family with depression, and there was trauma for me growing up, meaning that there were difficult situations that as a child, I didn't know how to navigate or understand. And so what perfectionism is it's like a defensive mechanism that says, you're the problem. Like, even though it's my parents were doing things or my family members were doing things. And then perfectionism told me that if I'm the problem and that if I could work harder at what I do, that I would not be the problem anymore. And the problem with this is that as we get older, we have these like childhood frameworks that we learn to see the world in. And as we get older, we don't question those frameworks, that we just think that this is how you see the world, that you have to work really hard to gain people's approval. You have to, earn love from other people. These are all frameworks that we don't learn how to question. And in addition to personal trauma and the way that perfectionism works in that, we also have collective trauma. And collective trauma is the way that all of us take our personal trauma and they bring them together, and we create actually a culture of perfectionism. So I think when we look at a culture where like, I'm just working really hard and striving and pushing myself and I'm kind of personally never enough, we have to look at the environment again to say, well, why is everyone pushing themselves so hard? The problems with perfectionism are that we really cut ourselves off from honest connection when we're in perfectionism, that we can't really let our guards down. We can't be vulnerable. We can't admit that we make a mistake. We feel not good enough all the time. Anytime we achieve something, it's not good enough because we still feel like we're the problem. And so we push ourselves even harder. And so often when we're looking at perfectionism and self-care, we have to understand that we're looking at self-care from a perfectionist framework, meaning that we look at self-care and we think that we're not good enough at it. And we think that we have to push ourselves harder. And we think that no matter what we achieve, it's not good enough. And this is me. I work, with women who are professionals in the Washington, D.C. area, and hundreds of women, and they all have the same story, that they're not good at self-care, that they need to work harder, that they need to kind of like fix this thing inside of themselves. And that's why having a word like perfectionism is so powerful, for us to be able to look at ourselves and say, oh, this isn't just me. Like, this is the thing that I struggle with. And actually everyone around me is struggling with it. And I want to say one more thing about perfectionism, because if you don't relate to this kind of work really hard perfectionism, which I call type A perfectionism, and you might relate to type B perfectionism, which is procrastination. Procrastination is the idea that like, I will do it later. And what procrastinators do is that they actually are waiting for the perfect time to do something. And because that perfect time never really comes, they just don't do it, which is not that big of a deal. But I know a lot of procrastinators, and I have these tendencies myself. I'm both like very type A in moments, and then I can be very resistant type B in moments. I'm married to someone who's very like, he goes to procrastination when he's under stress. And there's such a story that we tell ourselves about our like being lazy as procrastinators. And I think it's so much more helpful just to label it as perfectionism and understand that there's something underneath it that like is fear-based, and that we can start to work with that. So that was a lot. So before I get into like what actually does help us in this, I'm just going to look at these, what I and FF have said here, but feel free to put anything else into the chat box too. So I is saying trying to practice self-care in an environment that is too attached to a toxic culture can be pretty hard. Any advice to overcome that? Yeah, I think it's such a good point. And I think the first thing is you can never lose sight of how hard of what the culture is. That like you have to be very critical in it. And it's not like it isn't, you don't have to be negative to be critical. I think you have to just understand that you're swimming upstream, meaning that like you're always going to be pushing against what other people are doing around you probably. And to be easy on yourself. I think that if it, you know, you can do a lot just for yourself personally, which we'll get into, but if you feel like you're not able to always take care of yourself when you're working at a job where people are expecting a lot of you, like to be easy on yourself and not to expect yourself to have great self-care when you're working in an environment where there's not self-care. Or if your family is not a family that practices a lot of self-care, to understand that it's going to be really challenging, and to not judge yourself for not being able to do your self-care perfectly when you're in moments where you don't have control over it. And then I think really embracing the parts of you that you can control and how you can start to make these little shifts for yourself to practice more self-care. And Afaf is saying, to be honest, I'm a big perfectionist, and that perfectionism is causing me so many mental troubles, unfortunately. I'm sorry to hear that. And I relate so deeply. I look at perfectionism like, here in the United States, we have like 12-step programs, and I know they're around the world too, that you have to go into recovery if you're an alcoholic, and I think we need like a 12-step program for perfectionism, that it's very deeply ingrained in how we see the world. And it really can cause, it just sucks the joy out of life. It tells us like so many false things about ourselves. And so I hope some of what I get into next can be helpful, because I think there are ways to really start to work with perfectionism more. So what can we do about this? This is hard. I've sort of set up the problem here. And the solution is something called Kaizen. I'm going to put this in the chat box. It's a Japanese word, and it means good change. It means small change, and it means ongoing change. So it's a Japanese business philosophy, actually. And it's the idea that you can build a really successful, always adapting company if you, instead of focusing on really big changes that, you know, the collective nervous system cannot handle, that you focus on the smallest possible change, and you get really excited about that little change, and then you look for the next small change and you work on making that work, and then you get really excited about it. And so what I have found to work with perfectionism, which tells us we always have to push ourselves, that everything has to be huge and important and monumental, is that we start to say like, no, I'm going to do something really, really small for myself. And some of the Kaizen things that really help me, and then I talk to people about, are where you plug your phone in at night. This is a small thing, and it's a great Kaizen thing, because it probably will take you about a minute to take the place where you plug your phone in to charge at night from beside your bed to across the room, or sometimes even to the next room. And so what does that do for us? One is that you're gonna probably look at your phone less before you go to bed at night. And maybe you'll have a book by your bed that would be like an inspiring book. Or maybe you have your journal by your bed, and you can spend the 10 minutes that you would be on your phone, like reading or journaling or meditating or doing something for yourself. You probably will get a little bit better sleep by not like stimulating yourself by being on your phone. And then in the morning when you wake up, that before you go find your phone, you will have a moment to reflect on how you're feeling, and not just habitually kind of go for phones. And I use phones because I know that that's a big self-care thing for a lot of us, is that we're just on our phones a lot. I'm very addicted to my phone, and it's very troubling to me, because I know it cuts me off from a lot of the kind of authentic connection I want, and yet it's my phone. I'm like always picking it up. And so I have to kind of create habits to help me with that. Another one that I did lately is I deleted the app off my phone for my email. So I can do it through my computer, and there's a really like workaround way I can do it on my phone if I really need something when I'm out. But it has just given me so much more time to like not always, it's funny because for so long I still was just scrolling to that place where I hit that thing and it wasn't there. It was like I had to retrain my nervous system to be like, nope, we're not going to check your email on our phone anymore. And so those are two Kaizen moves that it took me less than a minute to delete the app and less than a minute to change the plug and place of my phone. And they've given me so much more time and energy and space. Some other ones that are not tech related are thinking about if you want to wake up earlier in the morning, and like, let's say you sleep in to like 8:30 in the morning, but you have this dream that you could get up and like do some exercise or like journal in the morning. So instead of trying to wake up at like 6:30, which would be a 2-hour difference, which would be a huge change, that you would actually shoot for 8:15. Which is not very dramatic, right? Like, no one would be excited if you're like, I woke up 15 minutes earlier today. And yet, if you can practice that, if you can get your nervous system used to that and start to make a routine out of it, and then maybe in a few weeks, you can wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning and feel good about that. And then when you're ready, it'll be 7:45. And then within 6 months, you could probably be waking up at 6:30 in the morning, and it wouldn't feel like a really hard thing. It would just feel like natural. And so a lot of what Kaizen is, it's about looking for what are the bigger habits you want to create in your life? And then how do you break them into smaller pieces? I say, like, if you want to start running in the morning for exercise, that like put your shoes by your door, or put your shoes right when you walk out of like in bed, or I like to do yoga in the morning. So like I put my yoga mat out when I wake up in the morning, my yoga mat's right there and I step on it. It's so much easier for me to be like, all right, I'll do some stretches in that way. So Kaizen, it's not I say it's not sexy. It's not like interesting. It's not something you could brag about on Facebook and people would get excited about. And yet, when you can embrace it and start to practice it in your life, I've seen people dramatically change their life within 3 months practicing Kaizen. If you can really start to get excited about little changes, how do I just make a small tweak? And there's one part which can be hard for us if we have a lot of perfectionism, is that we have to genuinely get excited about it. And that can be hard. It can be hard to celebrate ourselves if we feel like there's so much more we want to do. How do we celebrate just like 10 minutes getting up out of bed a little bit earlier? And yet I think that that's kind of the central thing of our self-care, is that we have to learn to celebrate ourselves as we are in this moment, rather than waiting for someday in the future when we're more perfect, where we can start to practice self-care and then finally start to like ourselves. That it's radical in this moment. We have to start liking ourselves here. Okay, and Aya saying, what do you think results in not being able to have a routine? Like you say, you're going to do something every day, so it becomes a habit, but it never works out. Well, the thing with Kaizen, they say, is if you try to do it and it doesn't work, you tried to make too big of a change. And so you should try something smaller. So that is like put your shoes by your bed, and maybe you have to like trip over your shoes for 2 weeks in a row before you finally get out the door. But change takes time. It takes time for your nervous system to start to get used to that. And it's really important to respect that you need to take the time that you need to take for this stuff. It's taken me just so many years to like establish habits and routines, and I'm always reworking them too. And I'm saying, okay, Afaf is saying, I prefer to say habits than routine because I find the routine very boring and unmotivating, like the fact of repeating things at the same time. Every day I prefer change, looking for systems where we can feel comfortable and feeling good while being productive. Yes, I think that's great. And if you don't like routine, also another one is ritual or rhythm, that you just have a way. And that can change. Like I know, like we're getting into spring and summer, and my routines and rituals are different now because it's warmer outside. It's, I'm outside more. I want to eat different kinds of food. As in winter, where it's like I'm inside more, and my family's routines are so different. So there is something about a routine that it feels very like sometimes, but it's always shifting. And I think there's a lot of creativity that we can use to recognize what's happening in our lives. Like if somebody in your family is sick, like your routines will change, and not to say like I failed at that routine, just to say something's changing and what do I need to do? And I think that's where we can feel really like we have a lot of power to be like, I can change things. And so many people, I think, don't feel like they're actually capable of changing very much. And so when I look at, we have to practice change, because if you can change one part of your life, if you can adapt your routines, then I think you can really change almost anything in your life, but you have to believe you're capable of change. Okay, are there any steps, Qatar is saying, are there any steps into embracing the Kaizen concept, as I have not been very fortunate with big changes? Such an interesting word, Kaizen. Yeah, I love the word Kaizen. I think it really is just to look at what's the bigger thing that you want. Like, do you want more exercise in your life? Do you want more time to paint? Do you want to cook more? And then to just narrow it down to be like, okay, like I want to cook more, then where am I getting stuck? Like, is it like for me, sometimes it's like buying groceries. Like I like to cook, but like just making time to buy groceries can be a lot. So how do I do that? How do I work that into my routine that doesn't feel so hard? Is it that I order the groceries? Is that I, put it on one day of week that on Thursdays I go grocery shopping, whatever it is. But it's starting to look at how you break it down into a smaller habit and be kind of strategic about it too. To say like, it's not working. Why? And then what could I start to change about it that might work a little bit? Afaf is saying, when things don't turn out well in routine, we feel disappointed. I know, yeah, and that's part of it, is that like you get to feel disappointed, and that shows that you care, that you wanted it to be a certain way. But the thing is not to give up and not to say like I'm not good at it, but rather like, okay, that was too much. How do I start over again? And like, how do I choose something smaller? And I'm going to take these comments here, and then I want to check in because Tova is here, and I want Tova to share a little bit about her self-care as well before we move on to the next part. Okay, Aya is saying a routine is a bunch of habits that you got yourself committed to, like reading, learning something on a daily basis, eating healthy food. Therefore, the word routine doesn't have a negative perspective, but we can look at it from a different angle. That is your opinion. Yeah, I feel like the routine is very liberating for me because I can be a very anxious person. And actually when I have routine, it grounds me, and it really like liberates me from feeling anxious, that I don't have to like figure out how to take care of myself every day, that I know how to do a few things every day that will make me feel taken care of. And Qatar is saying, yeah, self-reflection is super important. All of this is about self-awareness too, that we have to start to understand, like there's resistance. I'm having a hard time. I need to try a different approach. Why is this not working? And that's how you get to know yourself. You don't get to know yourself when everything always works out perfectly for yourself. Like if you had a friend and you only had positive interactions, you probably wouldn't have a very deep relationship with that friend. And so like when we're really endeavoring to care for ourselves, we have to be willing to go through some ups and downs in the name of just wanting to get to know who we are better and to understand how we work. Because this is the last thing I'll say, but we have a genius to us, and our genius, it involves our strengths, of course, and our talents, but it also involves the places that we want to hide, our vulnerabilities, what we feel ashamed about. And it's when we embrace all of that together with the spirit of kindness, that's when we really start to find our power. So how you do anything is how you do everything. So if you are struggling with your morning routine and you really get curious why that is, you'll learn a lot about yourself, I think. Okay, so I'll pause there, and then I want to introduce Tova, who's here. Thank you for taking the time. And it's important, to hear from outside perspectives of self-care, but I also really wanted people to hear from someone who is, within your community and practicing self-care. So could you share for a few minutes just about your own journey of self-care, what you've been learning?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So my name is Tova, and I'm a fellow at Ample Youth. And also just a teenager. So I'm in 11th grade, and I also practice a lot of self-care. But it's definitely been a journey for me to get there. So I'm not an expert in any way, but I'm just another young person who is getting through this crazy world. So first of all, why is self-care important? So I think that sounds like an obvious question to ask, but unfortunately, I think in our society that we live in, we don't really place enough emphasis on self-care. A lot of times, unfortunately, it's seen as being weak or like unproductive or taking a break, like self-care. Oh, you're taking a break from the productive things and then you're going to get back to it. Or even on the extreme, being considered lazy, or, oh, your head's not in a game or anything. And I think that's just because as a society, we place so much emphasis on being competitive and getting the most done and being productive. And I think that's increased by social media, where we're able to highlight just the best, most productive parts of ourselves. So you only see people's accomplishments. You don't see, when they break down. You don't see when they're having a hard time. You don't see when they're asking for help. You just see the end product with a filter on. Like you just see the very, very end of it. And so it seems like, oh, look at all these people who are doing so well. And they must be so productive and working 100% of the time. And I'm not doing that. So that's why I'm not as successful as they are. But that's not true. And so the first step that I had on self-care is switching that mindset, thinking that self-care is not a break. It's not like letting myself go. It's actually a strategic step to help keep myself healthy. And in the long run, it actually makes you more productive. Because I'm telling you, the people that are the most successful and the most productive, 100% of the time, they're going to hit a roadblock, and then they're not going to be as productive, or they're going to hurt themselves mentally. So actually, self-care is very strategic, and it actually will help you become more productive. Not that that's the main goal in life. You have to be working towards something, not just working. But that's just the first step that helps me really invest in self-care. And I'm not like a guru. I'm not an expert in it. But I've become so much healthier mentally once I started taking time for myself. So here are some ways that I do this. First of all, when I'm working, and these are just things that work for me. They might not work for you, so take it or leave it. But every 30 minutes when I'm working, I take a break, full stop. Like no matter what I'm doing, if there's a deadline, if it's Google Classroom and it's due at midnight, I take a break, at least 5 minutes. I close my computer and walk away. And that was actually the hardest self-care thing I started doing, because I get in this mindset where I'm working and I can't stop. But at some point I realized my personal limit is 30 minutes. For you, it might be more or less, but that's just what I found. That's the time where my brain starts slowing down and I start getting jumbled. So I just close my computer and walk away. And I don't let myself use any devices, because if I get on my phone or my computer or start checking the news, I just get sucked down into the virtual hole. So I, keep that away, set a timer on my phone. And some things that I do during my breaks, I might walk around the house, go out quickly, go into my backyard, take a breath of fresh air. I have 2 very adorable cats, so I often take them and pet them. I have 2 slightly less adorable brothers, but I talk to them too. That helps me just kind of get motivated again. And I don't think about work. It's hard, but I try not to. And I don't know if any of you have heard about it, but personally, I use it on it's this app where you grow plants. So the longer you're focused and not touching your phone, the more these virtual plants grow. And it's so funny because they're just plants that don't exist, but it's actually very motivating. It makes it like a game to keep yourself healthy and focused. So that's just something I use. Also, I don't know if Android has this, but on Apple, you have screen time. It's just in settings, and you can use that to place screen time limits on your devices, on your apps. So I usually put a few hour limit on social media or on Google or something. And then when I reach that limit, it just sends me an alert saying hey, you've reached your limit. And that just helps me mentally realize when I'm using too much social media or doing too much. That helps me make a sign to check out. Exercise is also very important, I found, to self-care. I'm not an athletic person at all. I'm not going to be going to the Olympics anytime soon, but just something as simple as walking, going for a quick jog, that's really personally helps me clear my head. I've also found I like to think that I am not. So I can't listen to, before I would listen to music or even watch Netflix as I did homework. Does not work. When I stopped doing that, I became so much more productive and just was able to doing is talking to friends or other people. That's been hard to do during the pandemic, but even just calling someone, FaceTiming, not texting, that might work for you. For me personally, it doesn't. But that helps me just get things off my chest. You don't have to be an extrovert. You can find one person you trust and talk to them all the time. But that really helps me get my thoughts in order. And also, I think earlier, someone was asking what happens if that pressure is coming from the outside. Sometimes, whatever family you're able to talk to them, I think having friends you can talk to really helps put that into perspective. I journal a lot. So usually at the end of the day, I take just a few minutes to write down my thoughts. Sometimes that few minutes turns into an hour because I just have so much to write about. Really, your life is not too boring to write about, I promise. You have something that you need to get off your chest at all times. So that's something I do. And last but definitely not least is asking for help when I need it. I think that was the hardest thing on my self-care journey to get myself to do. Because again, in our society, it's so competitive. We're like, if you're not the best, you're the worst. You know, you have to always be on top, always on edge, and on social media, you have to always be on the best. You have to always be your best. You have to always be perfect, and that there's no room to ask for help. I always viewed asking for help as a sign of failure. Like, if I'm asking for help, I must not be able to figure it out myself. But the best thing I did, I think, for my self-care was changing my mindset to think asking for help is absolutely a sign of strength. If you ask for help, you're going to improve yourself so much more. And like, I always thought I would be judged when I asked for help, but I'm telling you, you will not be judged. Like, think about, like, personally, if someone asked you for help, would you be judging them for asking for help? Or would you say, I'm so honored that they asked me for help, I want to help them? I'm guessing it would be the second one. And I found that the more you ask for help, the more people are willing to give you that help. Like, almost anyone is going to be willing to help you, especially teachers or, you know, counselors. Like, they're literally being paid to help you. And they also probably became a teacher because they like help friends. Hey, can you talk to me? Can you help me with people? I promise, who love you, who want to see you succeed. And you are not in your life alone. There's so many people that are going to be there for you. You just need to know who to ask and how to ask. So that's everything I'm thinking of so far. I can look at the chat and see what I see. Some people were talking. Yeah, rewarding yourself while working, studying, and exercising. Yes, I love rewarding myself. I have a big sweet tooth. So I sometimes get, I don't know if this is like a good strategy, but I personally reward myself with sweets sometimes, small ones, or just taking breaks. But yeah, being proud of yourself and giving yourself gifts. And it's all about initiating that mindset. Yeah, for sure. Well, good luck to all of you. And I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Tova. That was awesome. Yeah, you just like hit every point that we've been talking about. It's great. And I think you really like model too. It's like you can have all the habits down, but if you don't find joy in it, like, it's not going to work. I think part of it is that you just got to like get excited. Like, it's a game. Like, I'm going to take good care of myself and I'm going to like celebrate. And I think within like a consumerist capitalist culture, like we're really taught we're never allowed to celebrate because you never are good enough. And so I think celebration is one of the best kind of like rebellious practices, to be like, I'm going to celebrate myself. And like, it's very radical and great. So thank you for just sharing that energy with us too. Awesome. Well, I want to give us some time to do a breakout group, but before we do that, I want to go into talking about the second level of self-care. The third level is going to be really kind of short because we're practicing a lot of that right now. But the second one is important, and that's about the inner layer of self-care. So I'm going to speak about this for about 10 minutes, then we'll do 10 minutes in breakout groups, and then we'll come together and just check out here at the end. So, okay, second level of self-care it's the inner layer of self-care. And that is, you know, you can look at somebody and kind of have an idea of like what their outer self-care looks like, or it's how we show the world how we take care of ourselves. But the inner layer is the part that people can't understand when they see us. And somebody can look like they're doing great on the outside, but not be doing great on the inside. And it's a complicated layer because sometimes we don't even have language to talk about ways that we are feeling not like we're not taking care of ourselves on the inside. So I hope that I can give you some words and some concepts that might help with all of this. The first thing to understand about this inner layer of self-care is that we have to be able to actually feel what's going on with us. And that might sound like a simple thing, but you have to make sure you're not doing this one thing. So the thing is, it's behavior that I call numbing behavior. And a lot of people, they confuse numbing behavior with self-care. So numbing behavior is, I'm going to watch, 4 hours of TV. Like, I'm going to watch my show. I'm going to keep hitting the next episode. And in some way, you kind of feel like you're taking care of yourself because you feel better while you're doing it. That if you're stressed out in your life and you're like watching a bunch of TV, or for some of us, it's, eating a bunch. Some of us, it's drinking a bunch. Some of us, it's being on social media or being on our phones all the time. I think phones can be kind of numbing. And what numbing behavior does is it just takes the intensity that we're going through in our lives and it just turns the volume down on it. And so we don't have to feel it for a while. And that's why we'll feel a little bit better when we're doing numbing behavior. But self-care, it's not numbing. When we're practicing self-care, we actually are having to confront and deal with some of the difficult experiences that we're having. As Tova was saying, like you have to like sit down and start journaling and get to know yourself and feel the feelings that are there. You sometimes you'll have to make changes. Like if you're like really tuning into yourself, sometimes you'll have to set a boundary with someone to be like, you know what, I can't have you in my life anymore. I need you to not do this, which is very difficult sometimes. And so what many of us will do is that we just sort of confuse numbing behavior with self-care. And I think there are people out there that just spend their whole lives numbing, that they're not really paying attention to how they're feeling on the inside because they're engaging in behavior that just turns the volume down on their lives. I think everyone who's here on this call and in this group, you probably do not want to have the volume turned down on your inner lives. And so it's okay to numb. Like it's going to happen at points of our life. When I get very stressed out, I'll still be like, I'm going to watch some TV because I just really need to turn my brain off for a while. But the trick is that you don't want to confuse it with self-care, that you don't want to tell yourself like, I'm going to sit and watch a bunch of TV and that was taking care of myself, but rather you're going to say, okay, I'm doing a lot of numbing. What's actually going on with me that I don't want to be feeling my feelings right now? Does that make sense, that the distinction between numbing and self-care? I'm wondering if this is like an American thing or like other people. Okay, people. So I think it's just having a little bit of vocabulary can be helpful to understand what it is, to understand maybe why we're doing it, and then to look at what's going on under the surface of that. And so under the surface of the numbing, there's a few things. One is vulnerability. I think we're having a real renaissance of vulnerability right now within American culture, that it used to be this thing, like when I was growing up, that the word vulnerable, it always seemed to mean weak, like something is wrong, like you don't want to be vulnerable. And now there's a person named Brene Brown who had this great TED Talk about the power of vulnerability and perfectionism. She's done, if you've not read her books or watched her TED Talks, I highly recommend them. It's really, reading those has really, really helped me understand a lot more about myself. But she found in her research of people that the people that were the most vulnerable and understood how to do that with each other, that they were the people who had the most love in their lives. They're the people who had the best relationships with themselves. And so as Tova was saying, you have to ask for help sometimes. You have to be vulnerable. It's part of our experience of being human. And yet with the perfectionist culture, we're taught that we should keep all that down, that we shouldn't feel that. And I know for myself, even though I know that feeling vulnerable is a really important part of me being me, when I feel it, it still feels very wrong to me. I'm like, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I want to like numb it. I don't want, I have a moment where I always try to push it away. And so a lot of self-care, I think, is just recognizing that like, I have to be vulnerable. If you want to change in your life, like if you want to change any habit, if you want to change how you see yourself, you're going to have to go through some vulnerability. And there's a metaphor about like lobsters, that when they outgrow a shell, they have to kind of be exposed before they can grow the new shell. And so I have a friend and we say like, I'm lobstering right now, just meaning that like I'm changing and I'm growing as a person and it's really uncomfortable. I feel very vulnerable right now. And it's important to start to have a word for that, to understand that like, if you want to practice real self-care, you will change and you will grow and you will like understand more of who you are. And there are going to be moments in that where you feel really exposed and vulnerable and like, almost like you don't want to be doing it. Yes, Athaf saying Rising Strong, Daring Greatly, Dare to Lead. Those books are really great for vulnerability. Yeah, her other ones, one of her first ones, The Gifts of Imperfection, is one I really recommend too. So part of that is just embracing vulnerability, understanding that everybody experiences vulnerability. As Tova was saying, that you can't compare yourself to other people and how they're doing because you don't know what their experience of life is. The saying that I like is don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. That you have to understand that people are having this inner journey that you can't see. And so you just need to understand that like feeling vulnerable and having hard moments, it's part of being a whole human being. And it's not a sign that anything is wrong. And the fact that you can feel that means you're not numbing. And it's a lot of courage and bravery to actually just be in those feelings. Underneath that, I think there's also just a lot of understanding our emotions, what they're about. That like here in the United States, we're sort of habituated that if you're happy, that's great. Any sort of like positive emotion. But if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling shame, that those are bad things, that you shouldn't be feeling those. And so we're taught to sort of just repress those parts of our feelings and our personalities. And what I found is that those parts of who we are, they have so much intelligence to them. I feel a very strong relationship between our anger and our ability to set boundaries with other people. That if we can't feel that we are angry about something, or that we are upset, that we don't even know how to be able to set a boundary, or that a boundary has been crossed for us with other people. And so especially, I think culturally in the United States, men seem to have an easier time with anger than women. I know a lot of women just have a hard time feeling anger, or a really hard time expressing anger. And I think it's an important one for all of us to just understand that when we are feeling anger, it's important to take a moment to slow down. You don't have to feel angry and then just express it outward. I would not do that. Actually, I would sit with it and try to understand why you're feeling angry, why you're feeling upset, and understand if there is a boundary that you could be setting. Like if someone crossed a boundary, do I need to say no to something? And usually if you can identify what it is, then you can start to put that boundary into action. And that's the last point I have on this inner layer of self-care, is that if we really want to be putting this inner layer of self-care into action, it does require setting boundaries with other people. And this is a place that I think a lot of us can struggle with, that if we start to say what we really think, if we start to ask for what we really need, we're afraid of disappointing other people, we're afraid of making other people angry, we're afraid of, someone calling us selfish or telling us that we're not doing the right thing. And yet, if we want to become who we are and become authentic to who we are, setting boundaries is a really, really big part of this. I'll share a personal example of this, that when I was dating for a few years of my life, that after I broke up out of that big relationship, I was single, and finally I wanted to start dating. And I kept attracting people in my life that were, I say, emotionally unavailable, that anytime there would start to be emotion, I would feel that they would pull away, and I would feel really like rejected and abandoned. And it was really painful. But I was also practicing a lot of self-care. So I was like, what is going on with me? I feel this way. And it was understanding that, like, I actually, if I'm going to be in a relationship with someone the way I want to, I need them to be have feelings with me and talk about their feelings and not be afraid of feelings. And so when I started dating people and they would have this reaction, I would try to talk about it. If they couldn't talk about it, I would say, like, actually, no, I can't date you anymore. And it was like very kind coming from me. It wasn't like I wasn't actually angry with them. I just needed to like have that in my life. And I kept doing it. I think I had to over the course of 2 years, I dated 8 people. And anytime I recognized that somebody could not be emotionally available to me, I just set a boundary around that I recognized I would rather be single in my life than be with someone that I had to feel like I had to repress emotions around. And at the end of that experience, that's when I met my husband, who is very emotionally available. And he's dramatically different than anyone I've been in a relationship with. But I look back and I recognize that what I was doing over those 2 years was that I was changing my identity as someone who was willing to accept being with someone who was emotionally unavailable to someone who was not. And that took me setting not one boundary. I just set probably hundreds of boundaries within there. But when we can do it, and we can do it with our own self-care in mind, it transforms our identity and it transforms who we are. And I would say that setting other boundaries with other people is probably the hardest self-care practice that I know. And it's actually the one I think that can change our lives the most if we can just do it and take care of ourselves along the way. So that's what I wanted to share on the second one. And I'd love to have a moment that we could go into breakout groups. So I was thinking that we could do maybe groups of 3. Does that work?
Yes,
and we
that
could
sounds
have
good.